The ballroom glittered with 1,000 reflections. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors. Across champagne flutes held by manicured hands. Across faces that had forgotten what struggle looked like. This was the world of Alexander Sterling, a world built on numbers that most people would never see in a lifetime, let alone in a single quarterly report. The air itself seemed expensive here, filtered and perfumed, untouched by the grit and smoke of the city below. Sterling stood at the center of it all, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, his tailored suit worth more than some families earned in a year. He had made his fortune in entertainment, but more specifically, in judging it. For 15 years, he had been the face of America's most watched dance competition, the man who decided which dreams lived and which died under stage lights. His word was law. His taste was gospel. And tonight, surrounded by executives and celebrities who hung on his every syllable, he was holding court like a king who had never doubted his right to the throne. The mansion stretched across 3 acres of Manhattan real estate that had been in his family for 4 generations. 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, a ballroom that could hold 200 guests, and enough staff quarters to house the small army required to maintain such opulence. It was a monument to accumulation, to the belief that success could be measured in square footage and thread count. In the kitchen, separated by swinging doors and an entire universe of privilege, Maria Rodriguez wiped sweat from her forehead. 43 years old, but looking older, she had been cleaning Sterling's estate for a decade, her hands growing rough from chemicals, her back aching from bending, her silence growing comfortable from years of being invisible. The rich aged like wine, developing character and value with time. The poor aged like milk left in the sun, curdling and souring and eventually thrown away. She had come to America from El Salvador when she was 19, pregnant and alone, following promises that turned out to be mirages. She had worked every job that would have her. Factory lines, restaurant kitchens, hotel laundry rooms, and finally, domestic service, where at least the hours were predictable and the pay came regularly. She had built a life from scraps and determination, raised a daughter in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, kept them fed and clothed and safe. Emily Rodriguez was 22 and still believed in impossible things. She stood beside her mother, refilling champagne bottles onto silver trays, her movements efficient but her mind elsewhere. She had been coming to this mansion since she was 12, helping her mother during summer breaks, after school, on weekends when the bills piled too high. She had watched the wealthy float through these rooms like they were immune to gravity, like money had given them wings that mere mortals could never hope to possess. But Emily had her own kind of flight. When she was alone, when no one was watching, when the music played only in her head, she danced. Not the formal, trained kind of dancing that Sterling's television show celebrated with its perfect lines and expensive costumes. Something rawer. Something that came from the marrow of her bones. From the parts of her that refused to accept that beauty was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had discovered dance at 7 years old, watching a street performance in Times Square. A group of dancers had claimed a patch of concrete and transformed it into magic, their bodies defying physics, and common sense, and the weight of being human. Emily had stood transfixed for an hour, her mother calling her name over and over before she finally heard. That night, she had tried to recreate what she had seen, spinning in their tiny apartment, until she crashed into furniture and Maria had to catch her before she broke something. The obsession never faded. It grew. She saved birthday money and Christmas money, and found a studio in the Bronx that offered sliding scale classes. Miss Chen, the aging ballerina who ran the place, saw something in Emily during that first class. A hunger. A willingness to hurt for beauty. The kind of dedication that couldn't be faked or bought. Emily had trained for 6 years, scraping together enough for lessons by working double shifts at a diner, by tutoring rich kids in math, by selling handmade jewelry at street corners. She woke at 5 in the morning to practice before school. She stayed up past midnight doing homework after evening classes. Her feet became calloused and scarred. Her muscles learned to burn and keep moving anyway. Miss Chen told her she had something rare. Natural grace. The kind that couldn't be taught, only discovered, and refined through endless repetition. She had dreams then. Big, stupid, beautiful dreams. She was going to audition for Juilliard. She was going to dance with a major company. She was going to prove that talent mattered more than privilege, that art belonged to anyone willing to bleed for it. Then her father had died. Diego Rodriguez, a construction worker who had spent 25 years building other people's skyscrapers, collapsed on a job site from a heart attack at 48. He was gone before the ambulance arrived, before Emily could say goodbye, before any of them could prepare for the crater his absence would create in their lives. With him went Emily's dreams. Traded for medical bills and funeral costs, and the brutal mathematics of survival. She had been 19. She dropped out of the studio. She took more shifts at the diner, started cleaning houses with her mother, applied for night classes at community college. She hadn't danced since. Not properly. Not the way her body ached to move. But she watched. God, she watched. Late at night, in the dim glow of her phone screen, she studied choreography. Classical pieces. Contemporary fusion. Hip-hop. Ballroom. Every style and form she could find. And one routine in particular, posted years ago by a foundation dedicated to preserving modern dance history. The Last Light. Choreographed by Grace Sterling, Alexander Sterling's late wife, performed only once before her death from cancer 7 years prior. The video was grainy, shot from a single camera at a small theater downtown. But the dancing was transcendent. Grace had been in her late 40s when she performed it, her body showing the wear of decades of professional dance. But the emotion, the artistry, the way she made movement feel like visual poetry, it was everything Emily had ever wanted to achieve. She had memorized every second of it. Every turn, every extension, every breath. She had practiced it in her cramped bedroom, in the bathroom at work, in the stolen moments when her mother thought she was sleeping. She had learned it in secret, this beautiful, aching thing, this last connection to the person she used to be before survival became her only art form. Tonight, Sterling's mansion hummed with excess. He had gathered the city's elite to celebrate breaking into the Fortune 500, his company's valuation soaring past $8 billion. The guest list read like a directory of American power. Tech CEOs, hedge fund managers, film producers, politicians, media moguls, people who measured their worth in commas and zeros, who thought influence was currency and attention was wealth. The champagne flowed from bottles that cost more per sip than Emily made in a week. The canapés were tiny sculptures of caviar and gold leaf. A string quartet played in the corner, their music ignored by guests too absorbed in their own importance to notice beauty when it was right in front of them. Sterling raised his glass. The room fell silent with the instinctive obedience of courtiers before a king. Even the most powerful people here understood the hierarchy. Sterling wasn't just wealthy. He was taste incarnate. His approval could launch careers. His disapproval could end them. To achievement, he said, his voice carrying that particular timbre of someone who had spent decades being listened to. To those who dare to dream big and work hard. To understanding that, in this world, talent and dedication rise to the top. Always. The cream doesn't hide in corners. It doesn't make excuses. It rises, naturally, inevitably, to where it belongs. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. These were people who believed in meritocracy because they had benefited from it, who thought their success was earned rather than inherited, or lucky or built on the backs of people like Maria Rodriguez. Someone in the crowd, a venture capitalist named Richard Hampton, laughed too loud from too much champagne. He was in his 50s, red-faced and confident, the kind of man who thought his money made him interesting. But Alexander, what would you pay to see real talent? The kind that comes from nowhere, that surprises even you? Sterling smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. He had perfected this look over decades of television. Warmth that didn't require actual feeling. Interest that cost him nothing. In my experience, Richard, real talent doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from training, from resources, from opportunity. It's cultivated in the right environments, with the right teachers, with the right support systems. This romantic notion of raw genius emerging from poverty, it's a fairy tale we tell ourselves to feel better about inequality. The crowd laughed, uncomfortable but appreciative. He was saying out loud what they all believed privately. That they deserved their positions. That the poor were poor because they lacked something essential, some quality of ambition or talent that couldn't be taught. But if it did? Hampton pressed, enjoying his own boldness, emboldened by alcohol and audience. If someone walked in here right now and showed you something that moved you, truly moved you, what would that be worth? The question hung in the air. Sterling considered it, swirling his whiskey. 25-year-old single malt, smooth and expensive and utterly wasted on the palate of someone drinking for effect rather than taste. His eyes went distant for a moment, touching on something the crowd couldn't see. His wife, Grace. The only person who had ever made him feel like wealth was hollow, like maybe there were currencies he hadn't learned to count. They had met 40 years ago, when he was a junior producer, and she was a dancer in an off-Broadway show. She had been brilliant and poor and utterly uninterested in his money. She danced because she had to, because not dancing would have been like not breathing. She had challenged him constantly, pushed back against his cynicism, insisted that art mattered more than profit margins. He had loved her desperately. And when she got sick, when the cancer ate through her body faster than any treatment could stop, he had felt truly powerless for the first time in his adult life. All his wealth, all his connections, all his influence couldn't buy her one more day. She died in their bedroom upstairs, wasted to nothing, her last words about light and music, and the students she wished she could have taught. My late wife, Sterling said slowly, pulling himself back to the present, choreographed a piece 3 years before she passed. She called it The Last Light. It was her masterwork. She performed it once, at a tiny theater downtown, and then never again. She wanted to teach it to students, to pass it on, but the cancer moved too fast. He paused, his mouth curving into what might have been a smile or might have been a wound. If someone could dance that routine, here, tonight, with the skill and emotion it deserves? He paused again, longer this time. I would give them $100 million. The crowd erupted. Laughter, sharp and bright and dismissive. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the kind of thing rich people said, because the numbers had lost all meaning. Because 100 million was monopoly money, funny and unreal. The challenge was rhetorical. No one here knew the choreography. No one here would debase themselves by trying. It was a toast to the impossible. A way for Sterling to honor his dead wife without actually risking anything. In the kitchen, Emily's hands stilled on the champagne bottle she was holding. The glass was cold against her palms. Her mother was across the room, arranging canapés with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, unaware that the world was about to tilt on its axis. But Emily had heard. Through the door, through the laughter, through the layers of impossibility, she had heard. The last light. The routine she had practiced in secret for 3 years. The dance that lived in her muscles, like a second language, like proof that she was more than her circumstances. Her heart hammered. This was insane. She was a server. She was nobody. She was wearing a polyester uniform and flat shoes, and she smelled like kitchen grease. The people out there would eat her alive. They would laugh. They would film it. They would turn her into a viral joke, the poor girl who thought she could dance. But a voice in her head, her father's voice, the one that had told her stories about his village in Mexico and the impossible journey he had made to give her a better life, whispered, "What's the worst they can do? Make you small? You're already invisible to them, Emily." Maria's voice cut through her trance. "More glasses, mija. They're waiting." Emily nodded mechanically. She picked up the tray, her hands steady despite the storm building inside her chest. She pushed through the swinging door into the ballroom, into the light and noise and careless wealth. No one looked at her. She was furniture. Scenery. A function rather than a person. She moved through the crowd like water through stones, refilling glasses, invisible. A woman in diamonds brushed past her without acknowledgement. A man in a tuxedo handed her his empty glass without making eye contact. This was normal. This was how the world worked. The rich took up space. The poor made room, but her eyes found Sterling across the room. He was laughing now, accepting congratulations, already forgetting his own challenge. To him, it had been rhetorical. A joke. A moment of sentiment that cost him nothing, because no one would ever call his bluff. But Emily was the daughter of a man who had worked until his heart burst. She was the daughter of a woman whose hands bled from scrubbing other people's floors. She had learned that impossibility was just another word for things that hadn't happened yet. She had learned that the only real failure was not trying at all. She set down the tray on a side table. Her mother was in the kitchen, busy with the endless work of serving people who would never remember her face. Sterling was surrounded by admirers. The music system sat against the far wall, connected to a tablet for controlling the evening's soundtrack. Emily's feet moved before her brain could catch up. Not quickly. Not drawing attention. Just a server, just nobody, just empty air in human shape crossing a room to adjust the music. She reached the tablet. Her hands shook as she navigated through the interface. She knew Sterling kept everything digitized, had heard him mention once that he had preserved all of Grace's recordings, that he couldn't bear to lose even the crackle and hiss of old tapes. She found it in less than 30 seconds, buried in a folder labeled simply Grace. The Last Light. Original recording. 7 minutes and 43 seconds of her secret life made manifest. Her finger hovered over the play button. This was the moment. The fork in the road. She could walk away right now. Go back to the kitchen. Finish her shift. Keep her head down. Stay safe in her invisibility. Or she could step into the light and show them that talent didn't require their permission. She tapped play. The music started soft, a piano melody that sounded like morning and hope braided together. The crowd didn't notice at first, too absorbed in their own conversations. Then the strings came in, swelling, a cello line that sounded like heartbreak made audible. Conversations began to falter. People turned, confused, looking for the source of this unexpected intrusion into their carefully curated evening. Emily stepped into the center of the floor. The crowd parted instinctively, creating space, expecting a performance they had paid for, an entertainer Sterling had hired to amuse them. Then they saw her. Really saw her. The uniform. The ponytail. The flat shoes. The complete absence of stage makeup or costume or any of the markers that would signal professional dancer. Murmurs started. Who is that? Is this part of the entertainment? Did Alexander hire her? Emily didn't hear them. She was inside the music now, feeling it in her bones, letting 3 years of secret practice take over. The first movement was small. Just an extension of her arm, a rotation of her wrist. But there was something in it, some quality of attention, of absolute precision, that made nearby guests step back. The music built. Emily moved with it. Her body remembered everything. The opening phrase, a series of sharp isolations that represented fracture, separation, loss. Each movement was Grace's creation, but filtered through Emily's lived experience. When Grace had choreographed grief, it had been theoretical, artistic. When Emily danced it, she was remembering her father's funeral, the weight of his coffin, the hole in the ground that looked like the hole in her life. She hit each beat with precision that came from hundreds of hours of practice in the dark. From muscle memory carved deep enough to outlast doubt. Her feet, unaccustomed to dancing without proper shoes, found purchase on the marble. She made the limitations work for her, using the slip and slide of flat soles to add texture to the movement. Sterling saw her. His conversation with a Hollywood producer died mid-sentence. His glass lowered, forgotten. The whiskey sloshed but didn't spill. He was transfixed, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been fear. Emily continued into the second movement. The choreography shifted, became lyrical, searching. Her arms created shapes in the air that looked like questions without answers. She moved across the floor with control that seemed impossible given her footwear, her body finding lines that belonged in a professional company, not in a billionaire's mansion, not in a serving girl's bones. The crowd had gone completely silent. Phones remained in pockets, an almost unheard of occurrence in this age of constant documentation. Champagne glasses hung suspended. Food cooled on plates. They were watching something that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, something that violated the rules of their carefully ordered world. This girl, this nobody, this servant was dancing with professional skill. More than professional. With artistry. With soul. She was making them feel things they had spent years and fortunes learning not to feel. Vulnerability. Wonder. The uncomfortable recognition that maybe, just maybe, they didn't know as much as they thought they did. Sterling pushed through the crowd, his face drained of color. He knew this choreography intimately. He had watched his wife create it, had held her as she wept through the creative process, had been in the audience the only time she performed it, weeks before the diagnosis that would take her 18 months later. No one else knew this dance. No one could know it. Grace had never written it down, never taught it to a company. The only record was a single video, shot by a friend on an old camera, digitized and stored in Sterling's private files. He had never shared it. Never posted it publicly. It was his, a private wound he pressed against sometimes late at night, when the mansion felt too empty, and his success felt too meaningless. But this girl. This nobody. This servant in her cheap uniform was dancing his wife's soul made visible, and she was doing it perfectly. Better than perfectly. She was doing it like she understood it, like the choreography wasn't just steps, but a language she spoke fluently. The third movement began. The music soared into something almost unbearable, violins climbing into registers that sounded like screaming or singing. It was hard to tell the difference. The choreography demanded everything. A series of turns that accelerated into near impossibility, fouettes that required both power and precision, grand jetés that ate up the floor space. Emily's legs burned. Her feet hurt, the thin soles of her work shoes offering no support, no cushioning. She could feel a blister forming on her heel, blood mixing with sweat. She was exhausted from the evening's work, from too many days of too little sleep, from carrying burdens that should have broken her years ago. But she kept dancing. Because this was the only thing that had ever been truly hers. Because for 7 minutes and 43 seconds, she wasn't a maid's daughter, or a dead father's child, or a statistic about poverty in America. She was a dancer. She was art. She was proof that beauty didn't require permission from the wealthy, that grace was not something you could buy. Sterling's eyes were wet. Tears ran down his face openly, and he didn't bother hiding them. He was watching his wife dance again, except it wasn't his wife. It was this girl, this stranger, who somehow channeled Grace's vision with such fidelity that it felt like resurrection. Around him, hardened executives and jaded celebrities found their own faces damp. They didn't understand what they were feeling. Only that something true was happening. Something that cut through the performance of their lives to the raw humanity underneath. A woman in the crowd, a famous actress known for her Ice Queen persona, made a sound like a sob. Her date, a studio head, gripped her hand without looking away from Emily. Across the room, Hampton, the venture capitalist who had started this, stood with his mouth open, his champagne glass tilting dangerously in his hand. The final movement approached. Grace had designed it as a meditation on acceptance, on finding light even in ending. Emily's movements became slower, more deliberate. Each gesture carried the weight of grief transformed into something bearable. She executed a series of arabesques that seemed to defy balance. Holding positions that looked like photographs of longing. Of reaching for something just out of grasp. The floor work was brutal without proper knee pads, without a sprung surface. Emily felt her knees scrape against marble, felt pain shoot up her legs. But she stayed in character, made the pain part of the performance. This was what Grace had intended. Dancing that hurt. Dancing that cost something. And then the last phrase. A spiral turn that accelerated until she was almost a blur, her arms tight to her body, her head spotting with the precision of years of training. 1 rotation, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The music built to its climax, strings and piano converging on a single sustained note that hung in the air like a question. Emily stopped on a dime. Her arms extended to the sides, palms up, fingers reaching. Her face lifted toward the chandelier, toward the light, her expression serene despite the exhaustion and pain screaming through her body. The music's final note hung for a moment that felt eternal. Then silence. Emily stood there, chest heaving, sweat soaking through her uniform, utterly spent. The blister on her heel had burst. Blood seeped into her shoe. Her muscles shook with fatigue. But she held the final position, held it the way Grace would have, letting the silence be part of the performance. The crowd remained frozen. They were caught between disbelief and something deeper, something like reverence or fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. The poor weren't supposed to be talented. The invisible weren't supposed to demand attention. The natural order had been violated, and no one knew what came next. Then Sterling started walking toward her. Not rushing. Not performing. Just walking with the careful deliberation of a man who has seen a ghost and isn't sure if he's dreaming. The crowd parted without thinking, creating a path. His steps echoed on the marble, each one loud in the profound silence that had fallen over the ballroom. When he reached her, he stopped. Close enough that she could see the tears on his face, the rawness in his expression. Close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the way his hands shook slightly at his sides. "Where did you learn that?" His voice cracked, broke in the middle. Not the voice of a billionaire or a television personality or a man who had spent 40 years judging other people's art. Just a man's voice, broken and wondering and desperate. Emily struggled to catch her breath. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like they might collapse. But she stood straight, met his eyes, refused to be small, just because she was supposed to be. "I taught myself," she said. Her voice was steady, surprisingly strong. From a video. It was posted by the Grace Sterling Foundation, on their archive. "I've been practicing it for 3 years." Sterling's face did something complicated. Confusion, then understanding, then something that might have been anger or might have been grief. "That video," he said slowly, "was supposed to be private." "How did you?" "It was public," Emily interrupted gently. "For about 6 months, 2 years ago. The foundation was digitizing archival performances. They took it down when someone explained it was your personal recording. But I had already downloaded it." She paused. "I watched it every day. Studied every second. Your wife was the most beautiful dancer I've ever seen. Why?" The question came out like a plea. Like he was asking for something more than information. Like he needed to understand how his private grief had become this public miracle. "Because it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen," Emily said simply. "Because it made me believe that maybe I wasn't wrong for wanting this, even when I couldn't afford it. Even when everyone told me to be practical, to give up, to accept my place." Her voice dropped. "Your wife danced like she understood that art isn't about money. It's about truth. It's about being human in the most naked, vulnerable way possible. She danced like it mattered more than anything, and I needed to believe that was true." Sterling closed his eyes. A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh or a sob or both at once. His shoulders shook. Around them, The crowd watched in fascinated silence, witnessing the crack in a man who had built his entire identity on being unshakable. When he opened his eyes again, something in his face had changed. Cracked open. The armor of wealth and power and cultivated taste had fallen away, leaving just a man who had loved someone and lost her and forgotten, somehow, in the years since, what she had actually stood for. That was Grace's dream, he whispered. The words meant only for Emily, but carrying in the silent room. She wanted to open a school. Free training for anyone who wanted to dance, regardless of background or income. She wanted to prove that talent was everywhere, that we were just too blind to see it. He looked around at the opulent room, at the champagne and the marble, and the people who had never known hunger. I told her it wasn't practical. That talent needs to be cultivated in the right environment, with the right resources. That you can't just give away expertise because it devalues it. His voice broke again. I was wrong. I was so wrong. He turned to face the crowd, his voice rising, carrying the weight of revelation and regret. Ladies and gentlemen, I made a promise tonight. $100 million to anyone who could dance the last light with skill and emotion worthy of the choreography. I expected no one. I expected impossibility. I expected to make a toast to my late wife and move on with the evening. He looked back at Emily. But impossibility is just another word for things we haven't made room for yet. Things we refuse to see, because seeing them would require us to change. The crowd began to murmur. Hampton stepped forward, his face flushed, clearly thinking this was still performance, still part of the show. Alexander, you can't be serious. She's just extraordinary. Sterling cut him off, his voice hard now, brooking no argument. She's extraordinary. She taught herself a professional-level routine from a video. She practiced for 3 years in secret, with no teacher, no proper studio, no support system. She danced in work shoes on marble, and made it look effortless. He turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across them like a searchlight. She did what every single person in this room claims to value. She worked harder than everyone else. And I keep my promises. The room erupted. Not with applause, but with chaos. Conversations exploded like fireworks, loud and overlapping and desperate. Phones came out now, not to record, but to call lawyers, managers, publicists. The machinery of wealth began to turn, trying to process this deviation from the script. Trying to figure out angles and implications, and how this would affect them. Maria burst from the kitchen, her face ashen with panic. She had heard the commotion, the music, the impossible silence that followed. She had come to collect her daughter, to apologize to Mr. Sterling, to salvage the only employment she had. When she saw Emily standing in the center of the crowd, tears and sweat on her face, Sterling beside her, she froze. Her first instinct was fear. Raw, animal fear. Her daughter had done something wrong, had stepped out of place, had violated the invisible rules that kept people like them safe. She rushed forward, past the expensive people, past the stairs, pulling Emily by the arm. Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. She didn't mean to interrupt. We'll leave right now, please don't. Maria, Sterling interrupted gently, his hand raised to stop her panic. Maria, please. Your daughter just gave everyone in this room something we forgot existed. She gave us proof that we're not as important as we think we are. That talent and beauty and truth don't care about our bank accounts or our pedigrees or our carefully maintained hierarchies. He smiled, and it was genuine, the first real smile his face had made in years. She won. Fair and square. And I owe her $100 million. Maria stared at him. Then at Emily. Then back at him. Her brain couldn't process the words. They were in English, a language she spoke fluently after 24 years in this country, but they made no sense. $100 million. That was a joke. That was a number from movies, from fairy tales, from lives that had nothing to do with hers. Mama, Emily said softly, taking her mother's rough hands in her own. Mama, it's okay. I danced. I showed them. And Mr. Sterling is going to keep his promise. Maria looked at her daughter. At this girl she had raised in a one-bedroom apartment, who had never had enough, who had given up her dreams to pay for her father's funeral. Tears started to fall, hot and fast, years of exhaustion, and fear and hope spilling out all at once. Sterling watched them, mother and daughter, holding each other in the middle of his ballroom surrounded by people who had never worked an honest day in their lives. He felt something shift inside his chest. Shame, maybe. Or awakening. The recognition that he had spent 40 years since Grace's death becoming exactly the kind of person she would have despised. The next morning, Emily woke up in her cramped apartment and thought it had been a dream. The kind of dream poverty creates, where impossible things happen, And you wake up to the same ceiling cracks and the same pile of bills, and the same grinding reality. But her phone was full of messages from numbers she didn't recognize. News outlets. Agents. Lawyers. People who wanted pieces of her, who smelled blood in the water and wanted to feed. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at a business card Sterling had given her with his lawyer's contact information embossed in gold. Real gold, she had checked, scratching it with her fingernail. The man who had driven them home last night, Sterling's personal driver, had been so polite, so careful, like they were important. Like they mattered. The apartment felt smaller in daylight. 2 rooms, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. A kitchen with appliances from the 80s that worked most of the time. This was home. This was what safety looked like for them. 400 square feet of not being homeless. Emily's feet hurt. The blister had been worse than she thought, the whole heel raw and angry. Her knees were bruised purple from the marble. Her muscles ached in ways that told her she had pushed past every safe limit. But when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the dance in her body, still hear the silence that followed, still see Sterling's face cracking open. She had done it. She had stepped into the light, and she hadn't burned up. The process of actually receiving the money took 3 weeks and an army of lawyers. Sterling didn't just write a check, couldn't just transfer that kind of money without structures and safeguards. He set up a trust, ironclad and managed by a team of financial advisors who reported to an independent board. Emily would have access to the funds, but only for specific purposes. Education. Training. Investment in arts programs. Charitable work. Living expenses within reason. And, if she chose, the creation of something that had been Grace Sterling's dream. A school. Free dance education for anyone who wanted it, regardless of background or income. Talent as the only admission requirement. Emily said yes before the lawyers finished explaining. Yes to the school. Yes to the dream. Yes to building something that would outlive her, that would prove her father's death, and her mother's exhaustion, and her own deferred dreams hadn't been meaningless. The news coverage was inevitable but overwhelming. Every network wanted the story. The poor girl and the billionaire. The servant who danced her way to fortune. It was too perfect, too symbolic, too ready-made for the 24-hour news cycle's hunger for fairy tales. Emily did a handful of interviews, uncomfortable in front of cameras, hating the way they wanted her to perform poverty, to be grateful and humble and non-threatening. She refused to play the part they wanted. "This isn't a fairy tale," she told one reporter, a polished woman who kept asking about her feelings. "I worked for this. I practiced until my feet bled. I studied for thousands of hours. The only difference between me and the dancers on television is that they had parents who could afford to support their dreams. Talent doesn't care about your address or your bank account. It just cares whether you're willing to hurt for it." The reporter's smile tightened. That wasn't the story she wanted. She wanted gratitude and tears, and the kind of heartwarming content that made comfortable people feel good about inequality. But Emily was done being comfortable for other people. The school took 8 months to establish. Sterling donated a building in Harlem, a former theater that had been slated for demolition. It was a beautiful space, Art Deco architecture from the 1920s, fallen into disrepair but still structurally sound. Architects transformed it into something remarkable. 5 studios with proper sprung floors, dressing rooms, a small performance space that could seat 200, offices for administration and counseling. Emily hired teachers she had only dreamed of training with. Masters of ballet, contemporary, jazz, hip-hop, cultural dance forms that the mainstream ignored or appropriated without credit. She paid them well, insisted on benefits and respect, and the understanding that they were building something revolutionary. She named it the Grace Sterling Academy of Dance. Sterling wept when she told him, standing in the empty lobby before the renovations began, both of them breathing in dust and history and possibility. On opening day, 500 applicants showed up for 50 spots. The line wrapped around the block. Children from every borough arrived with their parents, their faces bright with desperate hope. Emily recognized that hope. She had lived it. She knew what it cost to want something this badly, to believe that maybe, against all odds, you might be good enough. The auditions took 3 days. Emily and her teachers watched hundreds of children dance, most of them with minimal training, some with none at all. They weren't looking for polish. They were looking for that thing Miss Chen had seen in Emily all those years ago. Hunger. The willingness to hurt for beauty, the kind of dedication that couldn't be faked. They chose 50 students for the first year. Ages 8 to 16. Black, white, Latino, Asian, every combination and background. Rich kids from the Upper East Side whose parents wanted the prestige. Poor kids from the Bronx who had never taken a formal class. They mixed them all together, told them that in this studio, the only thing that mattered was whether they showed up and did the work. Maria stood beside her daughter during the first day of classes, no longer wearing a maid's uniform. Sterling had offered her a position as the school's operations manager. She had wept when he asked, not because the salary was generous, which it was, but because someone had finally seen her as more than hands that cleaned. She walked through the building, checking on supplies, making sure the bathrooms were stocked, that the water fountains worked, that every child had what they needed. It was still service, in a way, but it felt different. She was building something now, not just maintaining other people's comfort. Sterling himself arrived just before the first class began. He moved through the building slowly, running his hands over the bare in Studio A, looking at the photos Emily had hung in the hallways. Dancers from every era and background. Martha Graham, Alvin Ailey, Misty Copeland, Savion Glover. Grace's photo hung in the central gallery, dancing the last light, frozen mid-leap, her face luminous with joy and grief combined. She would have loved this, Sterling said when Emily found him there, staring at his wife's image. She would have loved you. I know, Emily replied softly. I feel her sometimes, when I dance. Like she's teaching me through time. Like the video was a message from her to me, telling me not to give up. Sterling nodded. He had changed in the months since that night. Quieter, less certain of his opinions. He had stepped back from his television role, citing a need to reevaluate his priorities. The tabloids speculated about health problems or financial troubles or secret scandals. The truth was simpler and more profound. He had been reminded of his own mortality. Of the fact that money was a poor substitute for meaning. He had spent 40 years accumulating wealth and influence, building an empire of entertainment. Judging other people's dreams, while forgetting his own. Grace's death had broken him, but instead of letting it transform him, he had armored himself with cynicism and power. He had become the villain in his own love story. This school, Emily's courage, the way she had stepped into that ballroom and demanded to be seen, it had cracked the armor. Underneath, he found that he was tired. Tired of being the judge. Tired of the performance of importance. Tired of living in a mansion that echoed with emptiness. He started spending more time at the school than at his office. He sat in on classes, watching the children learn, seeing their faces light up when they nailed a difficult combination. He set up a scholarship fund, then another, then a whole network to identify and support talented young dancers across the country. His son, Ethan, who had been working in the family business with the dutiful resignation of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than a calling, began to change too. He was 32, handsome in that generic way wealthy men often are, and he had spent his whole life being groomed to take over his father's empire. But he started volunteering at the school. Helping with fundraising, managing social media presence, handling the business side of things so Emily could focus on teaching. And somewhere in those months, watching Emily work with the students, seeing the way she transformed children's lives with patience and expertise and genuine care, he fell in love. Not the performative love of their social circle, where relationships were transactions and marriages were mergers. Real love. The kind that made him want to be better, to build something meaningful, to stop coasting on his father's name and wealth. He didn't tell her for months. Just showed up every day, did the work, tried to prove himself worthy through actions rather than words. Emily noticed, but didn't acknowledge it, too focused on the school, on the students. On trying to build something that would last. The school's first performance happened 6 months after opening. Emily choreographed a piece herself, working with 20 students of varying skill levels. She called it The First Light. A meditation on beginning, on the courage it takes to try when the world tells you you're not enough, on the way hope persists even in darkness. The students practiced for weeks, their bodies learning to move together, to trust each other, to create something larger than themselves. The youngest dancer, a 7-year-old named Marcus from the South Bronx, could barely do a proper plie when he started. But he had rhythm in his bones and joy in his movement, and a smile that could light up a room. The performance was at the school's small theater. Emily had insisted on keeping it intimate, not wanting to overwhelm the students with pressure. But word had spread. The theater packed with press, donors, families, curious citizens who had followed the story from its beginning. Emily stood backstage, her students gathering around her, nervous and electric with anticipation. She saw her younger self in each of them. The ones who were terrified they'd mess up. The ones who were overconfident to hide their fear. The ones who just wanted to make their parents proud. Remember, she told them, her voice quiet but firm, you belong here. Not because someone gave you permission. Not because you proved yourself to a judge. but because art is a human right, and you're human. That's the only credential you need. Whatever happens out there, you've already succeeded by having the courage to try. The lights went down. The music started. 20 students walked onto the stage, their faces serious with concentration. For the first few seconds, they hit their marks perfectly, the choreography clean and precise. Then Marcus, the 7-year-old, forgot his next step. He froze, panic crossing his face. The other dancers kept going, and for a moment, it seemed like he might run off stage crying. But then he did something remarkable. He started making up his own movements, improvising with such wild joy and abandon that the audience gasped, then laughed, then started cheering. He grinned at the attention and kept going, his made-up dance somehow fitting perfectly with the music. His fearlessness giving the other students permission to loosen up, to stop being perfect and start being real. By the end of the piece, all 20 students were improvising, the choreography, a loose framework around which they built their own expressions. It wasn't what Emily had planned. It wasn't clean or polished or TV-ready. It was perfect, precisely because it was imperfect. Real. True. Art is a process of becoming rather than a finished product to be judged. When the final bow came, Emily joined her students on stage, pulling them into a group hug as the audience rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous. She looked into the crowd and found Sterling on his feet, clapping until his hands were red, tears streaming down his face. Beside him was Ethan, equally moved, his eyes finding Emily's across the distance. After the show, at the small reception in the lobby, Ethan approached Emily. They had worked together for months but always carefully, always professionally, both of them aware of something growing but neither willing to name it. "That was incredible," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Really? You're changing lives here. These kids, they'll never forget what you're giving them." Emily smiled, exhausted and exhilarated. "We're just getting started. I want 10 of these schools. 20. I want kids in every city to know that their dreams aren't stupid just because they're expensive. I want to prove that talent is everywhere, that we've been wasting human potential, because we can't see past money. That's ambitious." Ethan paused, gathering courage. "I'd like to help. Not just with money or business stuff. I want to be involved. Really involved. If you'll let me." Something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. Two people who had been born into vastly different circumstances, finding common ground in the belief that those circumstances didn't have to define the future, that maybe love was about building something together rather than completing each other. "I'd like that," Emily said. Across the room, Sterling watched his son and this extraordinary young woman, and felt something that had been dormant since Grace's death. Hope, maybe. Or forgiveness. The knowledge that he had been complicit in a system that crushed dreamers, but that maybe, somehow, he could spend his remaining years trying to build something better. Maria appeared at his elbow, carrying a tray of sparkling cider in champagne flutes. Old habits. But she was smiling, relaxed, proud in a way she had never allowed herself to be when she was scrubbing other people's toilets. "Your daughter is remarkable," Sterling told her. "She gets it from her father," Maria replied. Diego was a dreamer too. Worked himself to death building other people's buildings, but he never stopped believing that hard work mattered, that trying mattered. That maybe his daughter would have chances he never got. She looked at Sterling directly, meeting his eyes as an equal for the first time. "You gave her a chance to prove him right. To prove that his life meant something." "No," Sterling said softly. "She proved it herself. I just stopped standing in her way. I just opened a door that should never have been closed in the first place." The years that followed were not easy. The school faced constant challenges. Funding issues despite Sterling's support. Zoning battles with neighbors who didn't want those kinds of kids in their neighborhood. Criticism from traditionalists who believed free training devalued the art form, who thought dance should remain exclusive, elite, a luxury for the chosen few. Emily worked 80-hour weeks, balancing administration with teaching, with continuing her own training, with the 100 small crises that came with running an organization. She faced burnout more than once, nights when she cried from exhaustion, when the weight of expectations felt like drowning. But the school survived. Then thrived. Students began winning competitions, not because winning mattered, but because it proved something about what was possible. They earned scholarships to prestigious companies. They created their own works that pushed boundaries and asked uncomfortable questions about race and class and who got to make art in America. The graduates formed a network, supporting each other, opening doors that had been locked for generations. They became teachers themselves, choreographers, company directors. They spread out across the country, carrying the school's mission with them. Talent is everywhere, opportunity is not, and that's something we can change. Emily kept dancing too. She performed occasionally, small venues and special events, always donating the fees back to the school. But her real work happened in the studios, teaching, nurturing, recognizing in her students the same wild hope she had carried alone for so long. She and Ethan grew closer, carefully, both of them aware of the power dynamics that could corrupt even the best intentions. He proposed after 2 years, not with a diamond the size of a small country, but with a simple silver band and a question. "Will you let me spend my life building this dream with you?" She said yes. They married in the school's theater, surrounded by students and teachers and Maria crying happy tears in the front row. Sterling walked Emily down the aisle, and when he placed her hand in Ethan's, he whispered, "Grace would have loved this. Would have loved you both." On the 5th anniversary of the school's opening, Sterling stood at a podium during the celebration gala. His hair had gone completely white. He moved slower now, a tremor in his hands that spoke of age catching up with wealth. But his eyes were clear, clearer than they had been in decades. 5 years ago, he said, his voice carrying through the theater, I believed success was about exclusivity. About being the best, the richest, the most powerful. About judging who was worthy and who wasn't. My wife tried to teach me differently, but I was too deaf to hear. Too blinded by my own importance. He looked at Emily, standing in the front row beside Ethan, her hand resting on her small baby bump, the first grandchild of this strange blended family they had become. It took a young woman with more courage than sense to show me what Grace had been trying to say all along. He paused, gathering himself. Art isn't a luxury, beauty isn't for sale. And talent doesn't require permission from gatekeepers like me. It requires recognition. Support. The understanding that human potential is the only truly renewable resource we have. That every time we let poverty or prejudice or pride keep someone from becoming who they're meant to be, we impoverish ourselves. His voice dropped, became intimate despite the microphone. Grace would have been proud of this place. Proud of all of you. Of every student who walked through these doors and refused to believe that their circumstances defined their worth. He looked directly at Emily. And I am grateful, every single day, that I was foolish enough to make an impossible promise, and that Emily was brave enough to show me that impossible is just another word for things we haven't made room for yet. The applause was long and loud. But Emily wasn't really listening. She was remembering that night 5 years ago, the terror and exhilaration of stepping into the center of a room full of people who thought she was nobody. The feeling of music entering her body like truth. The moment Sterling's face cracked open, and she saw the human being underneath the wealth, the grief underneath the power, the love underneath the cynicism. After the gala, after the crowds dispersed and the building went quiet, Emily stood alone in Studio A. Moonlight came through the high windows, painting silver across the hardwood floor. She could hear the city outside, millions of people dreaming and struggling and trying, each of them carrying their own impossible hopes. She began to dance. Not the last light. Not the first light. Not any choreography at all. Just movement for its own sake. A conversation between her body and the silence. Proof that she was alive, that she had survived, that she had taken her pain, and her mother's exhausted hands, and her father's stopped heart, and transformed them into something that would outlive them all. Downstairs, Sterling sat in his car, watching the light in the studio window. He had given away $100 million. By any rational calculation, he should feel diminished. Poorer. Instead, he felt like he had finally made a good investment. Like he had finally understood what Grace had been trying to teach him when she was alive. That wealth is measured in the opportunities you create, not the ones you hoard. That legacy isn't about monuments to yourself, but about the room you make for others to become who they're meant to be. That love, real love, the kind worth having, is always about giving things away. He started the engine and drove toward his mansion. He had sold most of it, converted it into apartments for artists, keeping only a small suite for himself. The emptiness had finally become unbearable, and filling it with more objects, more wealth, more loneliness had stopped making sense. But it didn't feel empty anymore. Because somewhere in the city, in a renovated theater in Harlem, children were learning that their dreams weren't stupid. That beauty belonged to them. That talent didn't require permission. That grace, the real kind, the kind worth pursuing, was never about money at all. And in Studio A, Emily Rodriguez danced alone, a poor girl, who had become wealthy in the ways that mattered, her shadow long and graceful across the floor, moving through space like proof that the world could change, had changed, would keep changing as long as someone had the courage to step into the light and dance.